Hi, hello, and welcome to me not being able to read fantasy anymore. I feel like I have read so many mediocre fantasy books in a row that my brain has melted. This might be because I did read 9 books about a skeleton detective, one after each other. I'm not saying that it didn't help. So that might be one of the reasons that I am currently just in a reading slump. Regardless, I feel like I really enjoy fantasy, but it is such a form of escapism for me, which is not a bad thing. But sometimes I like to use my brain a little more and read books that make me self-reflect and also reflect on the world around me. Because the great thing about fantasy is it's a world so unlike the world we live in now. You don't really have to think about real life things. You just kind of go, oh, well, how does this magic system work? How is this world built? What are the characters up to? Versus non-fantasy books. And I know there are many genres that aren't fantasy, but I'm talking like just like fiction and novels and stuff like that that happen in the real world. You really need to think about yourself and the world around you more when you read those kind of books, in my personal opinion. So yeah, I kind of burnt myself out on reading fantasy books because I read so many of them in a short amount of time, and so many of them just started to feel like the same book. I think this is because I was reading Kindle Unlimited books and TikTok recommended books, which obviously are not the best that fantasy has to offer me. That's skullduggery and pleasant. I really burnt myself out. So I went on a purge and I looked for book recommendations that weren't fantasy, had no magic in them, had nothing to do with anything fantasy-esque. I just need a little reset. I feel like I was tiring myself out, and I also feel like when you read so many fantasy books, especially like the really overhyped fantasy books, it starts to be harder and harder to read actual novels, and it feels like it takes a lot more of my attention to get through a normal book. So I just wanted to gain my attention span back. I know that technically reading bad books doesn't lose your attention span, but I just wanted to like gain my attention span back a little bit and take some time to have some reflection while I read. So I read 3 books, which is not that many, but objectively I'm in a really bad reading slump, so that was the best I could do. And I wanted to talk about them. The first book that I read is Alone with You in the Ether by Olive Blake. I picked this up when it first came out a while ago, and I never got around to reading it. I was super intrigued by the description because it's a bipolar con artist undergoing court-ordered psychotherapy, and I was like, in Chicago, I gotta read this. I was living in Chicago at the time. I love the Art Institute. The premise just sounded really fun. And I did read it and I did enjoy it. I do have some issues with it. I know that Olive Blake wrote it and it was like a very personal book for her. And I don't personally have bipolar, so I'm not gonna like super speak on it, but to me personally, parts of the book felt like a Tumblr-esque romanticization of mental illness, in the sense that halfway through the book, Regan stops taking her bipolar medication because she just doesn't feel like herself on it, and she doesn't feel like she can be an artist, and it's just holding her back from her creativity. And I just feel like I wasn't a huge fan of that because it just feels like romanticizing your disorder and saying that like people who are on medication can't be their true selves. That's what it felt like to me while reading it. But it's basically about this girl, her name is Regan. She works at the Art Institute and she runs into this man named Aldo. He is a theoretical mathematician, and they have 6 conversations, and then after that they kind of grow a relationship, and it's about that whole journey. Again, I liked the book. I think around 3/4 of the way through they finally get together, and after that it started to lose me because, for one, there's just so much smut in it once they finally become a couple. It's an insane amount of smut. Every 2 minutes they're boning, and I'm fine with smut. It's not my favorite thing to read, and certainly not when the entire book is just every 2 minutes they're jumping each other's bones. So I wasn't a fan of that. And also 3/4 of the way through is when Regan starts to just like stop taking her medication so that she can make more art, and she's like, this is the best version of me, which I don't think is a great, I don't think anyone's taking this as, oh, I should stop taking medication so that I'm the better version of myself, but I didn't enjoy how that was handled. And again, I don't have bipolar, so I don't think that I am the one who can speak accurately about this. But I just didn't, it felt very much like romanticizing mental illness. So I wasn't a huge fan of that, and I wasn't a huge fan of how their relationship started to go. I know that it's showing that they're like a disaster on a collision course and that they're going to explode. But then I feel like when they get back together after that, it kind of feels like, oh, like, yeah, we might be bad for each other, but like, we're the only ones for each other. So I enjoyed it. I thought it was a really interesting story, and I thought that the writing styles were very interesting. I liked how the writing seemed to ebb and flow and change with the story and with both of the characters' viewpoint. As Regan stops taking her medication, the writing seems to get a little more chaotic, and in the beginning, at Aldo's point of view, it seems to be very person on the outside narrating his life. And I thought that was interesting. I thought it was a lot of different writing styles that portrayed the emotion of the story, which I think is really great, and I'll definitely read more of her work. But I don't know, it felt very 2012 John Green-esque kind of story. Would love to hear other people's thoughts on it, because it seems like a lot of people either really love this book or really hate this book. I think I gave it like 3 stars. I don't know. For half of it I liked it, and then when they started to get together, I just, between the smut and the collision course that was happening and the not taking medication because it makes her less creative, I was like, I finished it, but yeah, it felt a little weird. And then like the ending where he's staring at her art and he's like, oh my god, she's so wonderful, she's so talented, like no one understands her like I do. It lost me, which is fine. I still think that the writing was really good, and I'm definitely going to pick up Atlas 6 and check that out because I am intrigued. And also One for My Enemy, her newest book, I'm also intrigued by that one. I certainly will pick that up because I do like her writing. I just don't know how I feel about this story. I think any story that I would have read in middle school and like had an emotional experience with is a story that I'm not a huge fan of. Like anything that gives off Looking for Alaska vibes, I have to shy away from because it hurts my soul. Anyway, the next book I read after I read Alone with You in the Ether was The End of Loneliness. This book, I'm pretty sure, is a French author, and then it was recently translated into English. I simply loved this book. It is really sad, I'm not gonna lie. I did cry several times, but sometimes you need that, and it did what it was intended. I had a lot of self-reflection reading this book. This book is about these 3 children who lose both of their parents in a car accident, and they have to go off to boarding school, and it's really just about how this loss affects all of them and their relationships with each other and the lasting effects that them losing their parents has on the rest of their life. I personally am such a sucker on books that accurately depict grief. I think grief is, not to get like personal, but I think grief is such an interesting emotion to read about or like watch movies on, because you can grieve so many different things. You can grieve the death of a loved one, or you can grieve a friendship that you're no longer friends with, or just, so there are so many things that people have grief over. So I love reading about grief because even if I have fortunately never lost someone I'm really close with. I can reflect over other griefs that I have in my life, which is exactly what I was looking for in a novel. At this current point, I was just really looking for books that helped me look in on myself and out on the world, and this book was definitely really a self-reflection kind of book. The way that these siblings interact with each other and how they grow so distant and how each one of them handles the loss of their parents, I think was beautifully done personally. And then as they grow older, trying to reconnect and get back the relationship that they used to have and feeling conflicted over this. And then when they finally start families, feeling the stress and burden of not wanting to make your children go through the same grief and loss that you went through. It was so beautiful. It was a really beautiful book. I definitely would recommend it. If you're looking for a book that will make you have some self-reflection, and maybe if you're looking for a book that's a little sad, sometimes I'm in the mood to read a little sad book, I would recommend The End of Loneliness. It's such a beautiful book, and the writing and the prose are just so deeply moving to me personally. So yeah, I would highly recommend this book. This was probably one of my favorite books that I read during my little fantasy purge era. The last book I read, and I'm 50 pages away from finishing it, so my thoughts could change because we all know that sometimes 50 pages can make a huge difference in how you would rate something. That being said, I'm currently almost done with my last book of this little purge that I have to talk about. It's called The Biography of X. It's, I'm gonna say, historical fiction, kind of. It's basically the South decides to secede from the North, and it builds a wall around it and becomes the Southern Territory, and it kind of becomes extremely conservative, very religious, very misogynistic, and all of that. And then the Northern Territory kind of becomes very liberal and has like a bunch of like female presidents, and everyone has equal pay, and all of these things happen, right? Hi. What a baby. It's about this very famous artist named X, who the author is married to. When she dies, she asks that no one write a biography on her. And this man decides he's going to write a biography on her anyway. So her wife reads it, and it's filled with a bunch of inaccuracies. She takes it upon herself to research X's past and write an accurate biography. I think it's a very, very interesting story because X is such an interesting character. It kind of gives me Anna Delvey vibes because she does a bunch of research on people that she needs to know in New York City, and then she kind of fakes it till she makes it as an artist. So she befriends all of these rich people and mooches off of their money as she creates all of these personas. She's written books, she's produced music, she's written music, she's become this hugely known artist. She's just wildly known for all of these different personas that she's had throughout her life, all these really controversial art shows. And throughout the book, we discover more and more about X, and her wife learns that she's had so much kept from her all of her life. I think it's just a very interesting story because slowly but surely, her wife just starts to resent X for all of the things she kept from her. And you slowly start to see that like X was not that great of a person. In my heart, the end is going to be like we learn this one giant thing about X, like she's not dead after all, or like something else really huge. So I'm super excited to finish it because I think it's going to have a crazy ending. I would certainly recommend this book. I think it has a lot of jabs at the current political environment that we're in now. It is just really well written. It sometimes feels like an actual nonfiction book, but there are just so many interesting things happening that I keep turning the page. Very interested to see what's going to happen at the end. I think it's going to be really amazing. I would certainly recommend this. I think if you enjoyed The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, you might like this because it is a historical lesbian relationship, but I think this has a lot more substance. I feel like X as a character is so fleshed out. I think it's really interesting how the author has created this world that's obviously nowhere near ours. The world she's created is so well fleshed out, and the characters are so well fleshed out that even though it's very Handmaid's Tale-esque dystopian, you still feel like they're real characters in a real place. It feels like you're reading about actual historical events because she ties in real people who are in this world and real historical activists in this book, so it feels all the more real. And I just thought it was a very interesting book. It's done so well. I would certainly recommend it. And I'm really excited to finish it. I'll let you know in the next video if the ending was as good as I'm expecting it to be. That's all I read on my little fantasy purge. I'm definitely going to try and make sure I filter in more non-fantasy books in between my fantasy reads. That way I don't get as burnt out as I did this time around. But I am super excited because I've picked up a few more interesting books that I haven't seen in a lot of like book talk videos or booktubers, so I'm hoping that it will be something a little different and a little more interesting, because I feel like I've just been in a loop of reading the same kind of fantasy over and over again. So I'm excited to read those, but from now on I think I'm going to try and shuffle the genres I'm reading. That way I'm not getting burnt out on a certain genre. But that's all I have for you guys today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you in the next video. Peace, peace.